Okay, let's go ahead and get started. We'll still have folks coming into the waiting room and into the lobby, but the team will take care of that. So good morning, everybody, particularly to those of you who are here in Southeast Asia, South Asia, East Asia. Good afternoon to our colleagues who are joining us from the Pacific. Good morning, early morning to those of you coming from further west. And also good evening to those of you who are joining from the Western Hemisphere and North America. My name is John Garrity. I'm going to be the facilitator and moderator for this joint webinar hosted by the Asia Development Bank and the International Telecommunications Union. We are going to be focusing today on advances in closing the ICT connectivity gap in Asia and the Pacific. So we have a full program, a lot of insights, a lot of presentations. We kindly ask that if you have questions, if you just put them into the chat window. And of course, because right now we are at around 85 participants or so, and the number keeps increasing, if you could kindly just keep yourselves on mute for the duration of the entire webinar. That way, that'll make sure that we're progressing nicely. On my end, if you happen to, while I'm speaking, if you happen to hear a baby crying, that is my new 3-week-old baby daughter, who may be reminding me that it's feeding time. But I have promised Thomas and Atsuko and the organizers that I will not be changing any dirty diapers while the camera is on and I am working on the moderation duties. So this is the agenda. Just a few instructions that we shared. Chat window for questions. If you have if any problems, just put them in there and the team will answer them. We have 6 presenters over 5 presentations, so it's a very full agenda. I'm not going to go into the bios of each of our presenters. That information is on the ITU event page. It's also in this presentation that you can peruse later. However, I do want to introduce them and their titles. So we're going to get kicked off here with a presentation by Thomas Abell, who joins us from the Asia Development Bank. And Thomas is the Chief of Digital Technology of the Digital Technology for Development Unit at the ADB. After Thomas, we will hear from Amir Riaz, who is from the International Telecommunications Union. And Amir is a program officer in the regional office for Asia and the Pacific. Following Amir, we will hear from Rahul Shah from the GSMA. Rahul is the director for the Mobile for Development group covering the Asia Pacific. And then our 4th presentation is going to be a joint presentation from Sonia George and Anju Mangal from the Alliance for Affordable Internet and the Web Foundation. Sonia is the executive director for the Alliance for Affordable Internet and head of the digital inclusion program there. And Anju covers the Asia Pacific as a regional coordinator for A4AI and the Web Foundation. The 5th presentation is going to come from Scott Minahan, who is the managing director for Windsor Place Consulting. And after the presentations, we will go into a moderated question and answer session. So please submit your questions. We'll also do a group photo. So we'll ask you to turn on your cameras at some point, and then we'll have closing remarks from Atsuko Okuda, who is the regional director for the International Telecommunications Union covering the Asia Pacific region. Throughout the presentations, we're also going to be presenting poll questions. So we hope you're able to answer those poll questions, and we will discuss some of the insights from the poll questions as we get into the moderated question and answer session. So quickly, why are we talking about connectivity today? I think we all recognize, particularly during the coronavirus pandemic, the importance of connectivity, and it has come to the attention, particularly in the general public, how important connectivity is. And if you have been following the GDP growth revisions in the news or presented by the International Monetary Fund in its World Economic Outlook, we're seeing constant revisions downward of the impact of coronavirus to global growth and global GDP. It's not clear yet if we're going to see a V-shaped recovery out of the recession that coronavirus has initiated, or if it's going to be somewhat of a U-shape or a W-shaped recovery. However, what we do know is that the impact and the influence of technology, particularly broadband connectivity, has been somewhat of a dampening factor to the external shock that has been brought about by the coronavirus. So you see here what the IMF has said just this month, that technology has been a resilience factor for the global economy. And as an example, from the United States, half of the US labor force has been working from home amid the coronavirus onslaught, up from 15% previously. So it's quite a big jump. And if you know the size of the U.S. labor force, that's quite substantial. Now, the U.S., of course, is a service-based economy with very robust connectivity, and so the impacts, of course, will be very different depending on what country we take a look at. But we all know, working remotely and using Zoom and other web-based conferencing facilities, that we are able to continue with our productivity. And just as another personal example, when my baby was born three weeks ago, my wife and I we were separated in the hospital. I was not allowed to be in the delivery room. However, because of the power of LTE and strong Wi-Fi in the hospital, while we were separated for 8 hours, I was able to actually see my baby immediately after birth because my wife had has WhatsApp on her phone. And so through the power of broadband, I was able to still participate in that life event. Now, even prior to coronavirus, we understand and we understood the impact of connectivity, and it's very well documented. If you look at the economic literature, the macroeconomic impacts are very well documented, and you've probably seen some variation of this very famous data that was first presented by Christine Kiang and the World Bank in the mid-2000s, basically showing that for every 10 percentage point increase in the penetration of different ICTs, there is a corresponding GDP per capita growth impact. This impact is well documented at a microeconomic level as well in different sectors, from agriculture to health, government services, et cetera. And this is some analysis that we did at USAID and presented last year, but also with regard to the SDGs. ICTs are specifically mentioned in 4 targets of the SDGs, and there are at least 38 other targets that rely on universal and affordable access to ICT. So the impacts of connectivity are well documented. However, there are still major gaps in access and adoption, and that's what we're having a conversation on today. So this is a global view, and this is data from last year, but our colleagues on the call will present to us updated numbers from the ITU and GSMA. But essentially what I wanted to point you to is the information in the red box showing that, yes, there are over 5 billion people who have mobile subscriptions. However, that means that there are still billions who do not have access to a basic mobile phone. There are slightly over half the world's population are now internet users, but even more so, there are billions who are not enjoying the benefits of the internet, and there are even more people who do not have mobile phones that have internet access on them. So that's 3G or above. Now, what does this mean? So with coronavirus has demonstrated the importance of connectivity for consumption smoothing, communication smoothing, productivity. However, what coronavirus has also demonstrated is that for individuals who do not have access to the internet, there's a sort of a divergent effect that coronavirus is exerting. So if you take a look at the cartoon to the left, this is just a depiction of the situation that's arising between individuals and students, in this case, who have access to resources that allow them to continue studying, such as broadband internet, versus those who do not. And so this is just a depiction of what's happening across a range of different sectors between different groups of people. And I'm sure you all have seen the photos of students in Indonesia, in the Philippines, and in your countries, where students are climbing trees or they're climbing hills to try and access connectivity so they can participate in productive activities. So just another quote from the IMF. This is from the managing director, and basically this is demonstrated by the fact that coronavirus has triggered a mass migration from analog to digital, but not everyone has seen the benefits, and the growing digital divide is set to become one of the legacies of this crisis. Just a quick plug for the Broadband Commission's 10th anniversary State of Broadband 2020 report, Tackling Digital Inequalities, A Decade for Action. This was just launched over the weekend, and we go much further into this discussion in this report. The URL is there, and I encourage you to take a look at it. So that's setting the scene. Now we're going to hear from our presenters who are going to go into much more detail about some of the obstacles that we see in terms of universal connectivity in the Asia-Pacific region, and some of the recommendations and suggestions, the programs and the policies that these organizations are spearheading. So with that, let me hand it over to Thomas Abell from the ADB to kick us off into our first presentation. Thomas, the floor is yours.
Thanks, John, and congratulations again. And thanks also for everyone for joining and for inviting me. I'll get started. So just a quick overview of ADB. We were founded in 1966, and we have 68 members, 3,200 staff from across 60 countries. And we basically provide annually about 32 billion in total financing between lending, grants, and technical assistance. Our COVID-19 response programs have will add up to approximately 20 billion. And the main story as an MDB is that we have been mainly an infrastructure bank, mostly focused on physical infrastructure, roads, bridges, power plants, that sort of thing. And I think what this presentation is trying to do is try to demonstrate the urgency and the need for more investment at all levels in connectivity, and what ADB's perspective, because we actually have done a lot of work in this area, and just want to cover where we think some of the opportunities are. So our member countries basically cover the Pacific all the way through East Asia, South Asia, and the Central Asia. And so we have quite a range of countries, from China to very small Pacific islands. And the challenges, development challenges and connectivity challenges are quite, dramatically different across them. And as John mentioned, the pandemic really has accelerated the trend toward the digital economy. We've seen the digital economy coming in Asia. Asia's a very high growth region, and it's dramatically impacted ADB over the years as many of our member countries are graduating to middle and upper middle income countries. And the digital economy is really where all of the the change is happening, and we've been following this in our economic projections and our investment plans. But the pandemic has really blown the lid off of the digital economy, and we know remote work, we're all working from home. People are using e-commerce now that never did before. People are using digital payments. The governments that had put digital payments in place before this have done a much better job of being able to quickly get support to their citizens during the pandemic. People are requiring e-learning, digital health care, even the use of online entertainment and gaming has taken off globally. And many of these activities will revert somewhat back to normal, but we know, we've seen examples where, John's example that 50% of American workers are working remotely now. The expectation is that probably about 20% of those people that had transitioned to remote work will remain in remote work. And we're seeing that even for ADB staff in Manila and in other places, that many of them, will want to retain that, that the advantages of that, maybe not full time, but it's a huge change. Of even 10% of the affected people continue working remotely, or continue using these remote solutions. It will dramatically change the way the economy works. So we need to recognize connectivity as a basic necessity, and particularly true in Asia, where we already have high growth rates and higher income levels than some other developing regions, where I think this recognition is more feasible for countries to actually gain. The challenges are, first, in our developing member countries, that there are many places with low density and low income populations, and this means the infrastructure cost is just higher per user. So you can't get to a position where everybody has equal access to connectivity, because there's going to be a natural variation based on the the density of populations and the geography. And development programs are needed to fill the gap. The private sector will never serve the lowest density, lowest income areas voluntarily, because they just can't make money there. But we do need programs like universal access funds, investment support, and even low income subsidies where those are needed. And really understanding that infrastructure levels will need to be varied based on density and geography. I think one of the hardest problems is the connectivity is not a fixed thing. You know, we're going from 4G to 5G now, then we're going to go to the next G after that, and you can't roll all this stuff out everywhere all the time. So we need to manage that. What's the right connectivity for a remote area, low density area versus a city? What can development banks do for connectivity? Well, we can invest in infrastructure projects directly, and we do this: submarine cables, communication satellites, broadband networks, last mile connectivity infrastructure. We also provide grants and technical assistance. We support policy actions like national broadband planning, competition policies, rural access fund development. And we also generate demand and urgency through our development initiatives in our traditional programs like transport, energy, education. All of these areas are demanding more connectivity and can be upgraded with digital solutions that need connectivity. So we're finding, you know, all of our programs are generating demand for improved connectivity. And we have some examples I'll talk through that ADB has invested in over the years. For example, Pacific Island submarine cables, the Pacific communication satellite that was launched recently, and you know, a Philippines shared government connectivity program. These are kinds of things that we do, and you know, dozens more like this in ADB. For our Pacific submarine cables, this slide is a very good overview because you know, the Pacific Islands are very low income and remote, and they even within an island chain, you know, there are multiple islands, and connecting them all currently, you know, without submarine cables really requires geosynchronous satellites, and those are quite expensive and limited bandwidth, especially for, you know, for low income areas. And where you can put in the submarine cables, it just dramatically improves the you know, the availability, and so we've done over the years many of these cable networks and supported them in our developing member countries across the Pacific, and you can see basically 6 of them here, probably total of you know, $200 million in funding. And this is, I think, something that, you know, continues to this day. The cables continue to be laid, and it's very important for, especially for island nations. And then a more recent one was this Pacific One satellite that was launched this December 2019. This company came to ADB looking for financing, and we provided a $50 million loan because they actually were serving the Pacific as well. It's basically a broadband satellite, geosynchronous, that's serving the Pacific. And you know, this was something that ADB had never invested in a satellite company before, and it was kind of a risk because we don't have a lot of expertise in that area, but we actually leveraged some of our support. We have staff from the Japanese and European space agencies that helped us look at this and understand the technology and the company, and make our private sector team comfortable with, you know, with this type of investment. And it has gone very successfully, and I think ITU has actually published some materials on this as well, because it really has made a difference. It was launched in December 2019, just in time for some disasters in the pandemic to hit, and is now actually serving, you know, quite a lot of people across the Pacific. We also provide technical assistance. Just a couple of examples here are, one, providing advice for the Philippines on the national broadband plan, how they can do, you know, fiber right of ways and leverage the electricity networks to make it easier to lay fiber, and you know, share infrastructure and rights of ways and this sort of thing, which, you know, has helped the expansion in the Philippines. And we also have done some publications. One example is in Central and West Asia, where we basically looked at the different levels of school connectivity across different regions, and, you know, how different governments are basically providing ICT for schools. So these are kinds of things we do, and the pandemic has really raised the bar on our view of connectivity. And I think that, we're looking for partners and we're looking for more information. We're actually working with ITU to look at case studies and make it more visible on how we can ramp up some of our activities in the area of connectivity. And that's it for me. And I'll pass it back to you, John. Thanks. And I'll be available for questions after the rest of the presentations.
Thank you very much, Thomas. And thank you for, first of all, with the ADB and the ITU for hosting this webinar, but also for raising the point that there is a role for public investment, whether from governments or from DFIs to play because of the limitations in the expansion of private sector-led infrastructure. So with the next presentation, we're going to shift to Amir Riaz from the International Telecommunication Union, who will be giving the next presentation. As we make this transition, though, we do have a poll question that we would like everyone to answer. If we could pop up the poll question to give us a sense of who is here joining us today, since we have over 100 participants. And I'll just leave it to our ITU colleagues to end the poll when all of the participants have answered. In the meantime, we can transition over to Amir for the next presentation.
So let me start my presentation. Just to give you an overview of what I'm going to present. Mainly, I will discuss two of the issues that are the focus of this webinar as well. I will go into some of the initiatives that ITU has been doing and some of the examples of the partnerships and the initiatives that we are taking. So the two focus areas that we are discussing in the webinar are connectivity and connectivity that is affordable. So to build up my case, let's start with some of the statistics from the Asia Pacific region. For the connectivity, we have some stats in ITU. Amongst them, one slide that I'm sharing is the percentage of households that have internet. Now, if you see the Asia Pacific region, it is just around 51%, but it is below the world average, which is around 57.1%. So what this means that there is a lot of work to do in connectivity, but this is not just only a sad picture because in Asia Pacific, we have a huge population. So if you see on the other side, the numbers that are connected, even if it's 50% of the population of Asia Pacific, it will turn out to be a huge number. But still, around 49% of the households in Asia Pacific remain unconnected even now. Now, on the second issue of the affordability, there are many different ways and technologies to connect, but for the affordability chart, I have just picked out the mobile data and voice basket. We have a complete statistics on others as well, but for this, I'm using only this chart. And these rates are in the percentage of GNI, the gross national income. If you see Asia and the Pacific, we are not the best, but not the worst as well. Just like in Africa, the prices are very high, even for the low usage. But some of the focus is on the right side of the chart, the developing countries and specifically the LDCs, the least developed countries. We have around 12 LDCs in our Asia Pacific region, and you can see these are the ones that remain most unconnected, and the prices there are really high even for low usage connectivity. So in both the terms, there's for connectivity or the affordability, there's a lot of work that is still yet to be done. Now, after defining the problem, let's see what is required. For infrastructure, what we have seen very recently, we just not only need infrastructure, but a resilient infrastructure. In case, for example, in the case of COVID, we have seen the ICT infrastructure, it has been burdened a lot with many people working from home. So what we need to see is that what more infrastructure or the people who remain unconnected, how to connect them and making sure, because we have the capex that is required is also limited. So we need to connect in a way that has the most impact. And on policy and regulatory issues, we need to see how the right-of-way issues can be resolved. And one of the most important, because wireless is the way to go right these days, The availability of spectrum and usage in a harmonized way is one of the most challenging, specifically in the ASEAN countries, which have a huge population on the border, and this causes a lot of cross-border issues, cross-border interference, radio frequency interference issue. On the affordability side, again, there are some solutions that require a competitive market, but there are some issues that are more of the standardization issues, like the harmonization of devices that could create a market of scales, breaking down the prices. Competition issues, then for the rural connectivity, you need effective USO organizations and the funds disbursement, because we have seen over the years there's a lot of fund that still remains within the USF organizations, and the organizations themselves are not that efficient to disperse the funds. So if we see in both of the cases, 2-3 common things that we could point out are that there are interventions or a more focus that is required, common focus is required on regulatory and the policy issues. But then again, how to make them in a way that they are more relevant, we need some tools and some best practices to go about it. What we understand from our interventions and the issues that we face in Asia Pacific, there is no one size fits all. We have to have a national intervention, or in some of the cases, it could be a very sub-regional intervention, and this could be also be done, but in a very smart way. I will discuss it in the later part when I conclude. But to achieve this policy and regulatory interventions, we must have some toolkits on the basis of which we could have some very effective interventions. Now, ITU has developed some tools, and I will discuss them here just very briefly to make sure to give you a highlight of what they are. The first is the mapping of the terrestrial cables, not only the terrestrial cables, but also microwaves, satellite earth station, IXPs, and other point of contact. Now, this is a project that we have done in partnership with UNESCAP in the region. And what it gives, it's the mapping of all the terrestrial and submarine cable within Asia Pacific. The data is provided by the governments and the operators, and it is validated before it is launched into the public domain. You can see it into the link that is below. What we can do from this tool is a lot of things. I will show the examples later on as well, but it's basically a GIS tool for planning and strategy. We are developing it to add some infrastructure cost estimation as well, which I will highlight later. But just using this tool, there's a lot of things that we have developed which could help our interventions at the national level or even at the regional level. An example is the case of Kazakhstan. If you see here the nodes of schools that are there, for example, the 2G school are in the blue, and using the map and connectivity that of the fiber and the coverage of 2G, we can see how to connect the schools that are remaining unconnected. You can see the lines here, and the lines give you an idea of what is the closest node with which the school could get connected. The reds are the schools that are not connected. So this gives a planning idea of how to connect what is the nearest point of presence of ICT infrastructure through which the school could be connected. The second example comes from Africa, the Sierra Leone. You can see the similar example, the red line in the middle, it's the fiber going, and again, seeing how to connect using the nearest point of presence. The last is the example of Kenya. Similar 2G, 3G coverage is mapped, and the fiber cable going through the country and the schools that could be connected. So in this way, this tools helps in interventions and seeing where is the need and where is the demand to connect. Now, building on this, we are currently in the process of collecting together all our solutions and guidelines into one form that is called the Last Mile Connectivity Toolkit. These are all the ones that are in yellow. These are being put together in the form of one toolkit, but it's not only a guideline, but it's also a tool. not only for schools, but many other like health centers and others. What it can do, I'll just take out a picture of it. You put some inputs, like for example, what is the connectivity requirement in a particular school? What is the preferred what is the preferred bandwidth required? What are the types of applications that are required? So based on the input, it will give you a kind of like an estimate or profile of what is the best possible connectivity solution, because it could be this cable solution, or it could be wireless or a satellite, based on the mapping that has been done in the ITU broadband connectivity map. And not only the best technology, but also an estimate of the cost that is going to be there. We are expecting this toolkit to be ready by the end of this year, and this for a launch in Q1. Now, coming to some of the initiatives, together with UNICEF, we have a big initiative called GIGA, in which we are connecting the schools. The idea is a 4-point implementation steps: the mapping the school, building affordable finance models, then putting up some infrastructure, and then empowering the connectivity through applications and tools. In Asia Pacific, we are targeting 6 countries that are mentioned. If you need to have some more details on this, the information, the link is below. And we are not only partnering with UNICEF, but other UN agencies and other partners, and especially the governments, not only the ICT ministries, but Ministry of Education and other, to have the implementation of this. At this stage, we are in the mapping stage right now in some of the targeted countries. The other initiatives that has come about as a response to COVID. This is a very recent initiative, which is the Connect to Recover. And the idea is to support the countries to mitigate the effect of COVID-19, especially the social and economic effect, and using the technology to reduce the impact. It's a 6-step process in which a methodology is done, and a national level interventions are. National level interventions are done because different countries are hit in a different way in our Asia Pacific region. For example, the countries in the Pacific, they may not have so many COVID cases, but due to the COVID, their tourism industry is hit very bad. So the assessments and the strategies that has to be developed has to be different for different countries, and approaches could be different. If you need more information, we would be ready to provide on this. At this stage, Japan and Saudi Arabia, they have already joined this initiative. They have provided funds to ITU, and we are in talks with other countries, specifically in Asia Pacific region, who have shown interest to join this. One of the other that is very applicable for the smart and rural connectivity is the smart village and island concept. We have already started negotiations and discussions with countries in Asia Pacific, including Indonesia and Vanuatu. The idea is to provide a platform that is not only easy to deploy, but also cost effective and secure to connect the villages, and this could be used to replicate in different villages, and a common we could combine different villages into a common solution, and this could be connected to different ministries for e-government applications and others, and this could be scaled out more as it grows. Now, this was one of the initiatives that we had been doing. Now, before ending, I would like to share some of the success stories and the impact that we have done with the partnerships. As mentioned by Thomas in his presentation, indeed, we had a very good collaboration with the satellite industry in the Pacific. We had 4 partners: Pacific Inmarsat, Intelsat, and ITSO, and our idea was to have rural connectivity in the most rural islands of the Pacific. 9 countries we had assisted, and the idea was to not only provide connectivity, but since the region is also prone to disasters and typhoons, so to develop a capacity amongst the rural population for emergency telecom. And this has been widely gone into the press as well. An op-ed has been published in the Americas, and many other in Australia, New Zealand. The news agencies have captured this success. So just to share what we have done in Samoa, this is some of example of the school that was connected. We have connected 5 schools. The minister in the left lower is inaugurating the school. The impact that it has created, what we have heard, that the Ministry of Education has informed us that after deploying these labs, the numbers of students joining the secondary and higher secondary school, they have increased. So this is one impact that could be quantified. And the schools and higher schools and colleges, they are using this connectivity not only for learning, but also distance learning, Australia and New Zealand. The second is in Vanuatu. In the picture in the middle left is the Prime Minister who's inaugurating it in the school, but the connectivity is not only in the school. It's also used to connect a health center in a nearby island, and the inauguration was done on the right side, last one. What we have seen that initially the project was to develop connectivity, but what we have observed that over the years that people have started using it for financial transaction, especially Western Union transaction, in which the people from who are outside the country, they are sending money using this connectivity solution that has been deployed. Similar is the case with Papua New Guinea, and these are the connectivities in the very rural part in which there is no electricity. They are using solar powered solutions to deploy this. One of the recent usages of this connectivity was in Vanuatu in April, when there was a typhoon Herald, which was a Category 5 typhoon. It was a big issue in Vanuatu in a sense because the COVID was there and all the ports outside the world and even in Vanuatu were closed. So they were able to use the equipment that was provided in the project to build up connectivity for emergency units in the field. Okay, for the concluding, what we see that connectivity is a solution, but a meaningful connectivity is something which is affordable. We have the tools that could help and assist the countries, and not only the countries, but also the partners developing partners, to strategize their investments in to create a biggest impact. And what we need to do is smart partnerships, partnerships that bring together the best expertise of the partners, and not only the partners, but also the people and beneficiaries who are there at the ground, because they know their region the best. I think this is one of my last slide. Yes, John.
Thank you very much, Amir. A lot of content and information and tools in that presentation. Let's quickly move to our next speaker, Rahul Shah from GSMA and the Mobile for Development Unit. And one of the things that Amir, of course, talked about was the importance of data and the transmission maps. I know GSMA has their own initiative and others have their own initiatives as well, but we have yet to have one universal data set on network infrastructure coverage and mapping. So that's something that hopefully maybe, Rahul, you can share a little bit about what GSMA is doing, and looking forward to hearing your presentation. Rahul, over to you.
So let me start off by, first of all, congratulating you again, John, and also thank you to the ITU and ADB for inviting me to present the mobile industry perspective on the connectivity gap. I'll actually be presenting on a report that we released just yesterday. It's called the State of Mobile Internet Connectivity. Sorry, this is just trying to get the controls right. Yeah, there we go. So who is the GSMA? We represent the interests of the mobile operators who've been around 30 years, 750 operators and about 400 companies from the broader mobile ecosystem are our members. I specifically work in mobile for development, which is the foundation arm of the GSMA. We've impacted 93 million lives to date. Yeah, that's real. 93 million is the right number. And how do we do it? We drive innovation in digital technology to reduce inequalities. And I'll tell you a little bit more on the next slide. So here's how we do it. We have of course, through donor funding, we have 10 programs that we run currently. I won't be able to speak about all the programs in the interest of time, but what I will do is talk a little bit about the Connected Society program that you see on the top right, which is actually the program that is addressing the access and usage barriers to mobile internet adoption. And how does Connected Society do that? It is we are, of course, supported by the UK FCDO and CEDA in three endeavors. One is we support mobile operators, innovators, and other digital players to increase mobile internet coverage and usage. We do this through, for example, our skills training toolkit, mobile internet skills training toolkit. We call it MIST, which introduces digital skills. And I'll come to why we need an intervention like that as we go through the slides. You'll see that. And then, of course, we have innovation funds, and we currently have a round which is closed for applications, but in deliberation. So we should have, we've invited applications from innovators, from startups, SMEs, and social enterprises from Asia and Africa to specifically to close the internet usage gap. And we should have some grants awarded in a few months. We currently have another round that is going, which is specific to the disability gap. So anybody interested in that can reach out as well. That is still live. The other thing we do is generate insights, and this State of Mobile Internet Connectivity Report is part of that insights stream. We also do advocacy with partners like ITU, with World Bank, and we also do capacity building for regulators and policymakers. So that's what Connected Society does. Let me now quickly jump to the trends we've seen over the last 5 years. Now, before I get into that, just on methodology, right? So we have two bespoke tools. One is the Mobile Connectivity Index. It has 41 indicators. I think I've provided a link to the MCI at the end of this presentation. I would really love it if you would go there and use this information that's available. Also, we do focus on consumer surveys, and this is in 15 LMICs this year. That together represent about 75% of the LMIC's population. We sample about 1,000 people, except in India, it's 2,000, I think. And this was a study conducted in 2019, so pre-COVID, right? So the results of our survey, you should keep in mind, are all pre-COVID. Sorry, I'm just having a bit of difficulty with the controls here. Apologies. Are you seeing my slides move?
Well, they're now we are on the Mobile Connectivity Index slide.
Okay. Sorry. So this is what I was speaking about. I think there's a bit of a problem on that. So these are the two bespoke tools: the Mobile Connectivity Index and the Consumers in Focus survey. Yeah. So what do our studies show us, right? Connectivity is, we look at it in two dimensions, basically coverage and usage. And as you see, the coverage gap is narrowing. So the bar chart on the left is all LMICs, and the map on the right is breaking down into the Asian regions. So what you can see is the gray part in the bar chart. That's your coverage gap, and clearly it's been narrowing over the last 5 years. But the usage gap, which is people who are covered by the internet but do not use it, that isn't really shifting. And in South Asia specifically, the usage gap is quite large. You see 61%. And where is this? Which segments does it impact the most? Obviously, rural urban divide. So clearly in sorry, I'm seeing some notifications which are in front of the slides. Okay, so rural urban and gender gaps, right? So you see the split, and what's happening is, as the chart on the left is rural versus urban, and the chart on the right is the gender gap. And I'd like you to focus on the gender gap here. In South Asia, you see about women are 50% less likely to use the mobile internet, and that's something that we need concerted efforts on. We have a program, Connected Women, a sister program of Connected Society, that works on that. Next, let's go into what are the barriers and drivers of adoption and use. And again, we focus more on adoption and use because you saw that that gap wasn't really closing. So the first barrier we talk about is the affordability barrier. The one on the left, you see the two charts on the left, those are for the device affordability. Over time, you can see in East Asia and Pacific, the device affordability has improved. And this is on the left axis is really monthly income per capita. And so you see device affordability has improved a little bit. In South Asia, a lot more over the last 4 years. But we're getting to a point perhaps of stagnation. So we'll see how that goes. But there needs to be certain intervention here. One of the things we've seen work really well in Sub-Saharan Africa is pay-as-you-go, ways to sort of finance the purchase of solar home systems. And I think that is something we can also explore in mobile handset domain. And then on the right, you see affordability. Now, this is the data bundle. So you have the phone, you have how much does the internet plan cost you? And again, South Asia, very affordable compared to a lot of the other regions in the world. East Asia and Pacific are right about the 2% mark, which is the target. But South Asia is significantly lower. And so that's a good thing. Awareness is a barrier that we see that, it's increasing. So people, do they really know what the mobile internet is, or do they not even know? So before you go to things like relevance, you need people to be aware. And we think that awareness is an increasing, awareness is increasing. So as a barrier, it's become less important. And encouragingly, actually, it's increasing more quickly for rural and as well as among women. And as far as the country breakdown is concerned, you see the chart, and the yellow portion represents the gains in 2019. So India and Pakistan have gained quite a bit. Now, this is probably the most important one, literacy and digital skills. So to understand these graphs, the one on the left is essentially saying, is literacy and digital skills a barrier, right? And so in India, you would say 63% of the people surveyed said, yes, I don't know how to use the mobile internet. And is it the one on the right says, is this the most important barrier? So you see about a third of the people in India say, yeah, this is the most important barrier for me to overcome before I can actually adopt the mobile internet. So this is really the top barrier, and not just in Asia, but around the world. And then lack of relevance. I won't go too much into this because this is a barrier that seems to be decreasing in importance. There was a time when relevance was very, very important, but we see that it is actually decreasing in importance. And we also see the mobile application ecosystem, local ecosystem, developing more and more apps, especially true in South Asia. Although we do need to be careful of what happens when you have a small population, like in the Pacific, where there are many different languages, and there it becomes a bit more difficult to bridge this gap. So in summary, for barriers, affordability, awareness, lack of digital skills. Skills, again, the most important one, affordability, the second largest in terms of adoption to the usage, but affordability is the largest one in terms of buying a phone. Lack of relevance is important, but preceding. Okay, so what is driving the adoption? As you would expect, messaging, social media, and making calls, the most common uses of the mobile internet. But you see the ones on the right, these are applications you would normally not have thought of. And this is pre-COVID, so this is not the COVID impact. You see education actually has gained quite a bit, and you also see health, eGov, etc. These are encouraging trends. So people are actually looking to do more on the mobile internet. Now, just a little bit of time on coverage. I know I'm pushing my 10 minutes, but 3G, 4G coverage, I think, we've seen that 4G coverage actually is catching up with 3G coverage. So you see in both regions, East Asia and Pacific, as well as South Asia, the yellow bar, which is 4G, is almost where 3G is. But what remains is the most difficult part to cover. Since 2014, operators and LMICs have actually invested about $320 billion in expanding and upgrading networks, right? But you should also consider that in rural remote areas, it can cost up to twice as much to deploy base stations and actually up to 3 times as much to run these base stations. And on the revenue side, it could be as low as a tenth of a normal urban site. So what can be done? Dividend, I won't dwell too much on this, but essentially, if you think of it, what you need is frequency bands that can cover large areas of the rural population. And that is usually at the lower end. So 700 megahertz is a great band. As TV channels move out of 700 megahertz with digitalization, it would be great to have that for mobile internet coverage. And then finally, what do we need to do? Coverage gap, usage gap. We think there are slightly different approaches. Coverage, I think, if you think of what is it that costs you money? It is setting up of the base station. It is running the base station. So, and part of that is energy. Part of that is the operations. And then the backhaul, right? So you have traffic that is coming to the site, but then how do you connect it to the main internet? And so these are the main areas. And trying to get those costs down through innovation is going to be really important. Collaboration, infrastructure sharing, and of course, policies. Yeah. Finally, on the usage gap, we need more. We know that the usage gap is about 6 times the coverage gap. Right? That's massive. And if you consider it from the mobile industry's perspective, it's really dead investment. I mean, in Bangladesh, for example, 80% of the population is covered by 4G by one operator, and in their customer base, perhaps maybe 30% at most are 4G subscribers. So you can see there's a lot of dead investment. We need to change that by building literacy, skills, relevance, and of course, partnerships. I will quickly close with a few links and that you can visit. And finally, acknowledgement to our donor, UK FCDO, for supporting us. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Rahul. So let's transition to the next presentation. That will be by Sonia George and Anju Mangal from the Alliance for Affordable Internet, who will talk further about affordability and access challenges, building upon the obstacles to connectivity that Rahul presented. Sonia and Anju, over to you.
So thank you, John, ADB, ITU, and our wonderful speakers. Sonia and I are super excited to join such a great forum. Bula from Fiji, and namaste, everyone. Hope you're well, despite the ongoing challenges we face today. It could be related to COVID-19 or dealing with a natural disaster or even running around after your kids and trying to join a webinar at the same time. I think we're all facing these challenges, but remember, we're in this together. So today, Sonia and I will present a key topic on advancing an affordability and meaningful access to connect the last 50%. I will do the first half of the presentation and Sonia will cover the second part. But don't worry, we're women and we're always concise and get straight to the point. So let me tell you what we do. The Alliance for Affordable Internet is the world's broadest technology sector alliance working to drive down the price of broadband by transforming policy and regulatory frameworks. Sonia?
Can you see the next slide?
Yes, I can now, sorry.
Good.
Working to drive down the price of broadband by transforming policy and regulatory frameworks. Sorry about that. We're spread across Asia Pacific region, Latin America, and Africa, and focusing on low and middle income countries. We have around 100 members from the public, private, and not-for-profit sectors, and from across developed and emerging economies. All of these diverse organizations have agreed to a set of good practices, which aim to ensure open, competitive markets, plus policies, regulations in place to lower cost structure for the industry. A4AI believes in a next slide. Sonia. Thanks. A4AI believes in a multi-stakeholder approach. In each member country, we form a national multi-stakeholder coalition. Our global and national advocacy policy framework is based on research-based evidence, and we develop research work that provides good practices for policy work. So based on our research, we work on specific urgent issues through policymakers and also through technical assistance projects. We're specifically tackling the affordability challenge and trying very hard to close the growing digital gap. And you've heard from the various speakers that we're always trying to reduce the gap, agenda digital gap. So we continue to work with governments, civil societies, international organizations, and other sectors to adopt new affordability and access targets. And we also continue to advocate on public access initiatives, encouraging access for marginalized groups such as women, youths, and also persons with disability. This is a very important thing to mention. And we continue to design gender responsive policy making. So this is all dear to me, and we're working across this various initiatives. So that's all in a nutshell what we do. And now I will invite my amazing colleague, Sonia, to present the next half of the presentation. Thanks.
Thank you, Anju. So great to hear you introduce the Alliance for Affordable Internet. Thank you, of course, to the Asian Development Bank and to ITU for organizing these and for inviting us. It's really a pleasure to be here and to be the two women presenting on the panel. Hopefully next time we won't be the only ones. A lot of data was already shared by many of you. Colleagues shared a lot of different information in terms of the gaps, the connectivity challenges, the drivers, really good recent data from Raul and GSMA. So we won't repeat that, but we'll highlight a couple of things that are important that I think can add to the dialogue that we hope to have. One is that while it's true that affordability remains a problem, and yes, it's improving in the region overall, the reality is that it's also important, and we like to call attention to the fact that it's important to think about affordability, not just in aggregate terms, but also in terms of how affordability plays out across different income groups in different countries. So through our annual affordability report that I hope you all know about, and if you don't, please do check it out. It's a wonderful publication that we put out every year with loads of really good analysis, but we also look at how countries are faring in terms of achieving the affordability target. And in the Asia Pacific region, where we cover about 25 countries, only 16 of those reach the target. But again, what's important is that even though some of them do achieve the target, in practice, in some countries, as many as 40% or 50% of the population actually cannot afford connectivity. And that's why you still have the low levels of connectivity in the region, and also the great divides that many of you have already shared. So I wanted to share with you a couple of highlights from some recent analysis that we at A4AI have been leading with the World Bank, with the Broadband Commission, as well as with the ITU team, looking at, given the connectivity challenge that we're all facing, given especially also the pandemic and what it has highlighted to the world, so what will it take for us to get there? What will it take for us to get to a level of universal access and universal connectivity by 2030? And we look at 2030 as a target timeline because, as you all know, the SDGs are aiming to that particular year. So the reality is that it looks like a lot, but it's not really a lot, right? $428 billion to bring the world to universal connectivity. And we define universal connectivity for purposes of these analysis as 90% of the population of 10 years and older. Okay, so we're not counting the babies. We're also not counting the super young, because there's a lot of privacy and data protection issues that are really important. And we also recognize the fact, and these are all the partners involved in this analysis, recognize the fact that there's always a percentage of the population that it's either not, is going to choose not to come online, or is going to be in such a location that it will be difficult to come online. Of course, our goal is to reach them, but it's always going to be a challenge. So connecting humanity, connecting the world, It's predominantly an infrastructure challenge, an infrastructure investment challenge, but it's not the only thing. And one of the things that we highlight through our analysis is that even for investments to be realized, the level of investment that we are estimating here that is required for us to get to a point where connectivity is really universal, we also need to think about skills and content. And we also need to think about policy and regulation and having the right frameworks in place that will support the right investments. Taking a closer look at the regions, and especially also by income groups across the different regions, what our analysis shows is that, sorry, I'm just moving the things here on my screen. What our analysis shows is that actually the South Asia and East Asia Pacific regions account for about 50% of the unconnected population in the world. And they also, by default, account for about 50% of the required investments. So your region, the region that we are here talking about that is of interest to ITU regional office and to the Asian Development Bank, I mean, you are and you make up 50% of this global challenge. That's a huge responsibility and one that we obviously have to think carefully about, not just the magnitude of it, but how do we address it? What are the kinds of things that we need to do to address it? So the other thing that is important to note here too is that 70% of that investment required is really investment in low income and lower middle income countries, okay? So you see that on the slide here. I don't have to give you the numbers. You'll have the slides available to you. But again, the magnitude of the challenge is quite large. But again, if you compare with resources spent on other industries and other investments, I noted Thomas earlier mentioned that ICT investments have not been the key focus of investments, for example, for the Asian Development Bank, but also for the other MDBs, which is right. The reality is that they need to increase, right? And comparing these kind of need with the investments in other sectors, this is actually not very large. So it's doable by 2030 if we actually bring our resources together and if there is the will to support this kind of requirement. Another point that is important for us to highlight as we think about investments and as we think about everything that is needed to be looked at from an investment perspective, but also addressing the challenge is that infrastructure alone is not sufficient. As many of you already pointed out throughout the different presentations, and I think Raul also made the point about the usage gap, it's important to understand that while we need to invest and we need to incentivize further investment across the board with private sector, with public sector, through partnerships, etc., the reality is that investment by itself is not going to take us to where we want to be, because if people don't have the skills, don't have the content, cannot afford, etc., investment is going to be underutilized, as our colleagues also pointed out. So it's important that we understand where the need is. How can we take decisions that in tandem can achieve connectivity and universal access, but without forgetting that we cannot just think about the supply side, we have to think about the demand side and supporting demand, stimulating demand, creating it, and making sure that everyone has the skills to benefit from the opportunity of being online. And this is precisely why A4AI works in many different ways to support not just international organizations, but most importantly countries on how to change and reshape their policy thinking and to guide their policy thinking to aim for a version of internet access that is beyond the traditional version of internet access that everyone has been talking about, which is this binary being online and offline type of access. And for us, what's important is to think about this concept of meaningful connectivity, which is really starting from the idea that you must have a certain technical minimum requirement that will allow everyone to fully benefit from the opportunity of digital connectivity. And meaningful connectivity to us is not only a framework that can guide policymakers to think about decision processes and investments and their own policy frameworks, but is a concept that means that everyone should have regular access on a daily basis through a suitable device, an appropriate device with enough data and a fast connection. And if we don't have those minimum requirements, in fact, we are not actually providing true universal access to the extent that we are also thinking about. So these are important concepts for us to consider as we move forward, not just from an investment perspective, but most importantly from a policy perspective. And again, with the caveat that you don't have to do everything at once. We do things in parts. We do in a sequential process, but in a way that also recognizes that different countries are going to be in different parts of their development continuum. And it's important to understand that some things will be more urgent than others. But overall, this idea of meaningful connectivity and meaningful access to the internet is absolutely critical for us to really raise the bar on what internet access should look like. Lastly, but not least, one of the elements that we heard only once today, but it's very important, is that even if we think about affordable data plans and affordable connectivity, without the proper devices, people will still have to face this major barrier, right? No matter how much we think about affordability of data, if you don't have affordable devices, people still are far from being able to benefit from the opportunity. And so device affordability has become a critical element of our work, our analysis, our thinking. I urge you to look at some of the recent research that we published, but also to consider some of the policy actions that we've been advocating for that will support this combination of policy actions that not only think about meaningful connectivity and internet access in a new way, but in a way that is more holistic and also brings devices to that equation. So things like tax reductions, proper use and efficient use of universal service and access funds, as well as different kinds of projects that will help people spread out the cost of devices through innovative financing mechanisms, et cetera, et cetera. There's a lot more to say about these, as you can imagine, but I'm going to try to be very fast to get to the last slide. So Anju and I can say that the two women on the panel met the requirements of the 10 minutes, or almost did. And thank you so much, all of you, for listening. And we would love to engage in a conversation about these topics. Thank you. Great.
Thank you, Sonia and Anju. There's a lot of content there that you shared that I urge our participants to really dig into. It's great to have the voice of the Alliance for Affordable Internet really bringing the civil society and the national coalition positions into the policy conversation, and the points that you make on the fact that even when countries do meet any sort of service affordability threshold, that still means that there are large segments of the population within those countries that are still priced out of access. And then, of course, the device affordability point and meaningful connectivity. This is something that we touched on in last year's Broadband Commission report, and it's been fantastic to see A4AI really take it forward and propose, how do you measure this and carry that conversation forward? So moving forward to our last presentation, Scott Minihane. It's last, but it's not least. It's the grand finale, and we're also a little bit pressed for time to get into Q&A. So Scott, I'll hand it over to you to give us a concise but insightful presentation so we can move into the Q&A session. Over to you, Scott.
All right. Hopefully everyone can hear me, and thank you very much for the opportunity to come and speak with everyone virtually today. My name is Scott Minihane. I'm the Managing Director of Windsor Place Consulting, and what I'm going to be presenting today is some of the material from some of the work that we've done with the ITU, with the World Bank, with the GSMA, and some of the work that we've done in the region. I've done some work in the Pacific as well, and also some of the current work that we're doing in ASEAN. So in terms of the presentation, we've got a very short period of time. So, but just what I would say to you is I've got a longer version of the presentation, which is available for download on the ITU website. And I'd recommend you have a look at that because it's got a lot more material, particularly on some of the topics that we'll go through today. I don't think I need to say very much. I think we all know where we're at in terms of the first global pandemic. And what we do have is across the board, an emphasis globally on flattening the curve, minimizing the spread of the virus. But we also have this, what we call in Australia, a twin, an economic crisis, where certainly and thankfully, ICT systems have been able to minimize some of that economic damage. And as we'll get into this presentation, and part of the focus here is about this gap, it's probably reasonable to say that those who've had service during this period have done okay. It's really the challenge about how do we address this connectivity gap during this period of time, because what I think we originally thought the COVID-19 type process was going to be 3 months or 6 months, I think is going to be a much longer period of time where the globe has to deal with it, and it's going to have some impact on our response. In terms of my focus today, I'm going to talk a little bit about spectrum and then talk about some of the work done for the ITU looking at the reg for COVID. But I think the key thing I want to start with is just to remind everyone here that most of the world is moving from 2G and 3G legacy networks, and that'll fall over the period up to 2025. 4G and LTE is going to be the key focus so that we have more than half of the connectivity in that space. And certainly in parts of Asia where I'm working, 5G is really starting to pick up, particularly for urban areas, of course. But over the period, as we start seeing lower frequency become available, and I'll talk a little bit about that later, is going to make more availability. And that's going to be a bit of a challenge, as we've heard already from A4AI on handsets and the GSMA, because some of those handsets are going to end up being a little bit more expensive than what we've seen with the 2G handsets. The other thing I would also say is that spectrum globally is the same in every country. Yes, we have issues around borders, but the key thing is that part of what we need to do is to make sure that as a country, we're maximizing that availability of spectrum. And this is a quick graph. Some of the members, or some of the people on the call, there's big differences across the region. Some countries don't release spectrum. Maybe in a small island environment, you don't need to release much more. But in other countries, what we've seen from work by the ITU is that demand is for a total of about 1900 megahertz of spectrum. Across the region, we see the Philippines leading, although if we don't, not including millimeter wave that Singapore has already released. But across the board, we see challenges and the need to think about addressing and making more spectrum available. And just I suppose without going into technology, because I understand this call involves a number of people who are not probably telco people, the new generation of equipment requires larger contiguous blocks of spectrum. So we need to make more available, and we need to make it available in larger single chunks for the technology to become more useful to us. So with that sort of spectrum background, I just wanted to then move on to the COVID response. And the ITU put together a very good program. There's a couple of papers, one of which I helped write for the ITU globally. There's an economics paper which is out, and I think there's more to come. Reg for COVID was a place where in the early stages and still currently, some of the experiences on dealing with the resilience and dealing with the telecoms needs through the period were able to be shared globally, and I'd recommend that site to you. What do we see as part of that response? And I think the key thing I wanted to say is that there are sort of three phases to that response under the COVID time. One is emergency, the second one is about recovery, and then what we talk about the new normal, or what we certainly in Australia describe as the new COVID normal. And they're not really about elapsed time. They're where you are in the process of addressing the impact of COVID on your economy and on your society, on maybe lack of tourism, whatever the case may be. And what we found during this process is that, and this is a graphic which is available and you'll find it, is you see these, as I said, demand for bandwidth increases, bandwidth for emergency and healthcare, but we saw these economic impacts that also needed to be thought about. And that also needs to be, I think, flow into some of the connectivity questions that we're looking at today. What did we see? We saw increasing need for bandwidth. We saw a lot of free services. And unfortunately, I think some of those things are now starting to, that emergency response of getting maybe additional data or having some countries funding that data is not going to last forever. And, all of that's going to then need to flow through the systems and needs and maybe another set of policy responses. We also saw network management. Some were voluntary. Talking about the US was, telecoms regulators and companies made a commitment to reduce their demand or to shape that. In other countries, we saw mandatory requirements to provide additional services. We also saw more flexible spectrum use. We didn't see it really much in Southeast Asia or Asia generally. Countries like South Africa in particular have been very, very good at releasing spectrum, perhaps because they've been slow in releasing generally the spectrum. They were able to offer a lot of temporary spectrum to help meet the increase in demands. And we all have also seen, I think, a big push, and you'll see more of this in relation to both 4G, 5G fixed wireless access. A lot of the new deployments that we're seeing in 5G are not just for mobile services. They're fixed line replacement. They could be maybe originally started around healthcare facilities, but now they're very much being deployed across cities and other urban areas. And then we've also seen the need to address some of the misinformation that 5G causes the coronavirus and all of those other things that unfortunately have got some oxygen on the World Wide Web. In terms of the recovery phase, I just wanted to highlight some things. And again, I'm not sure where all countries are at, but there's a real need to think about the next phase, in the next phase, about contact tracing apps, about handling clusters as they arise, accelerating, as I've indicated, some of the assignment of globally harmonized spectrum so that you can quickly address and deepen the networks by having that additional spectrum available. Accelerating some of the 4G and 5G deployments. And part of the challenge here is, I think, is that as we push into that world, it's too expensive for MNOs to run 2G, 3G, 4G, and 5G networks. And that's a question not only of spares, equipment, sites on towers, but it's software licenses, it's vendor support, it's things like that. Another one is deployment of fixed wireless access, which I mentioned already. We need to think about innovative and future technologies to bridge the digital divide, and we've certainly got to try and address some of the gaps that I think some earlier speakers have highlighted. And the other ones I think are fairly familiar, but given time, I'll skip across them. About misinformation, working from home means cybersecurity becomes key, and then trying to harness some of the new technologies around big data, AI and learning, whether that's about COVID health responses or dealing with the needs of the broader networks and the move into IR 4.0. In terms of the new normal, as I said, because I think that new normal looks like being a longer time away, some of the short-term measures may need to become permanent. We're going to have the whole changes to temporal demand, and we're going to have to think about some other things. What I would suggest is that most countries around the world have a broadband plan. I think those plans need to be revisited in the next 12 months to look at some of the issues around COVID and what have we learned about how working from home, studying from home impacts that, and to really accelerate this digital divide question, where it was maybe nice to do, now it becomes essential. Would recommend this other paper which came out last year, and because of obviously COVID came along, it didn't get as much people I think reading it from the ITU. And some of the issues that I think are really important for today's discussions are about setting some broadband targets for digital infrastructure. And we heard A4AI and the GSMA talk about the real issues around infrastructure, and that's really important. If you don't set targets, you always fall short. And I think that's really important. Thinking about rights of way for some of those backbone. Some of the earlier speakers have mentioned the need for backhaul. The real issue as you move into a 4G, 5G world is you need fiberizing of base stations or high capacity microwave systems. A mini link of 2 megabits a second access or 8 megabits is not going to cut it. Again, I've mentioned the spectrum and 2G switch off. Also, quality, I think, has become a really important issue as we become dependent, even like this type of call, we all want to have a quality service. And lastly, I've got a couple of slides just to sort of summarize it, and I hope this is valuable to you, is just some of our experience in working in these markets and with a range of organizations. But just to hit some of them, increasing broadband speed, capacity, and coverage, looking at those refarming of spectrum for 2G and 3G into these new wireless broadband links. And that should be technology neutral. We still have a couple of countries in Asia who charge to use a newer technology, which seems very strange. It's like a tax on investment, a tax on innovation. And those types of things, I think, need to be addressed. We need to think about rights of way, as I said, around fixed deployment, looking at some of the issues on addressing some of the backbone issues on fixed networks, national broadband networks, releasing spectrum. In Europe, we've had now 2 digital dividends in these 800 and the 700 megahertz. We haven't done a good job necessarily in Asia. Some other countries have done okay, but in Asia generally, we've been very slow to release the 700 megahertz. We really should be starting to think about the second digital dividend in 600 megahertz as well. And my last slide, hopefully I've kept to time. Improving network resilience and backhaul is really, really, really critical. We've now found how important our lives are around these types of connectivity issues. We need to facilitate affordable site acquisitions by MNOs and towercos to support small cells, larger cells where there's no coverage. We need to think about easing regulatory requirements and policy and providing policy incentives that may provide some flexibility on some of these issues. In the medium and the shorter term, we'll need to be more flexible. And I think this is really important. We need to bring forward the deployment of digital infrastructure, the assignment of in-demand IMT spectrum, and some of these new technologies. And I think, the industry is actually, as I said, has done a pretty good job. And I think hats off and congratulations to those who've done it, handled this additional demand and handled it pretty well. But what we do need to do is to think about how that demand will continue to change, continue to increase, and to provide services for those who don't have service today, whether they're in a coverage area or whether they don't have coverage. And I think that's really important. So lastly, the experiences during this COVID era, we need to learn from that in order to drive regional recovery and to arrive at a new normal. So thank you very much, and thank you as well to the ITU and Huawei for supporting some of the policy and regulatory research in this area. Thanks. Over to you, John.
Great. Thank you very much, Scott. There's a lot of content there, and those the reports that the Windsor Place Consulting has done for the ITU. It's chock full of great examples of what's happening in different countries, and something that we leveraged and noted also in the Broadband Commission report. So I encourage everybody to go there to really get a sense of what can be done, what has been done, and also what needs to be done to further build resiliency of networks across all of our countries. So we are running short on time, but we have a couple of things that we'd like to do, and we ask for your assistance and patience, and also staying with us for 5 to 10 minutes as we go over time. But first, what we'd like to do is we'd like to ask all the audience participants to answer another poll question. So 2 poll questions should pop up to get a sense of your thoughts on this particular topic. The questions are now showing. What do you think is the most important to increase the affordability of ICT connectivity in Asia and the Pacific? And then also, which of these actions is your own institution or organization possibly getting involved in over the next 6 months? So please read through those. There's quite a number of different options there. I'm also going to ask the speakers to reflect and give us their thoughts on what they feel are possibly the most important actions and activities that need to be done, or what might be a red herring, right? What might just be a distraction. And in the meantime, as you're answering the poll, if you could all kindly we're going to take a screenshot for records and for posterity. So if you could all kindly just turn on your cameras, fix your hair, show us your pearly whites. The ITU team will be taking a photo. Okay, here we go. Looks like we're getting a lot of folks turning on your cameras. That's great. All right. And I'll just count to 3 to get everybody to smile. Ready? 1, 2, 3. Smile. All right, let's do it one more time for the ITU team. 1, 2, 3. Smile. And they might have to click through different pages. Okay. Great. So we did want to get into a Q&A session and then also leave time for Atsuko Okuda to give us their closing remarks. The poll questions are still being answered, so please continue to do that. But I'd like to open it up now to the speakers and really to give us your sense of, okay, Asia Pacific, of course, it's a very large region. Yes, as Amir mentioned, everything, interventions are very context specific, but if you were to provide guidance and place a couple of bets on what are the sort of actions that the global community and participants in this call should really be pushing forward, what would that be? And as a related question, and maybe this is leading a little bit, but we did see in the question box some questions around new technologies, right? There was a question on what's the impact of LEO low Earth orbit constellations like SpaceX, Starlink, and Amazon's play. How's that going to impact last mile connectivity? And is this conversation going to be completely moot in 5 years' time? Similarly, what's really the importance of 5G for universal access and connectivity? Is that a necessary step or not? So with that, let me open it up to the speakers. What do you think? What do you all think? Whoever, feel free to jump in.
Hey, John, this is Thomas. I'll just jump in because I think, based on Rahul's inputs, that affordability of devices is a huge deal. And we already have, over 90% of the population in coverage zones. So affordability is the main point. And that's going to, devices and service are coming down rapidly in price. So it's a question of, are they going to come down rapidly enough to expand coverage or not? Or is the price point of the device that's acceptable going to, just keep going up and never really enable universal access? And then I think on the lower satellite, I think that's going to be the solution for the last 5% that just won't get won't able to have coverage via fiber because they're just too remote. They're too widely distributed. Thanks.
Thanks, Thomas. John, would it be okay if I go next?
Please.
Can you hear me? Okay. So, just to continue on Thomas's point on affordability, I think, we've got great experience from pay-as-you-go solar in sub-Saharan Africa. Just going back to something I said during my presentation, affordability of devices, it can be tackled in many different ways, right? Normally what you would like is very high scale manufacturing, and therefore, and high scale procurement. So, would it be possible perhaps for multiple operators to get together and source a single device, right? So that these kind of things where you could define a device which is considered to be good enough for a certain population, and then bring in a consortium to do purchasing. You could potentially explore that as a means. You could also look at pay-as-you-go. Yes, it needs some sort of support in terms of technology. So pay-as-you-go works on the ability to shut down the device, whatever the device is, whether it's a solar home system or if it's the mobile phone, if the person doesn't keep up with the payments, right? So, but will the regulators and policymakers allow that for a mobile phone? And technology is already available. That's not the challenge. So that's affordability. I think just 2 points. On the other actions, I think skills. Very, very clearly through our research, we're seeing that skills are a problem, and we need concerted action from governments and from banks, from operators, from other development organizations, from everyone to close that gap. In terms of new tech, I agree with Thomas on space tech. I think it's for the niche who really can't be covered using the traditional means. 5G, depends on who you are. So 5G for South Korea is an absolute yes. For Bangladesh at this point, or Pakistan at this point, no. The Minister of IT and Telecom just tweeted, the ministry, I should say, that in Pakistan, we want to fix 4G first before we go to 5G. And we're very glad that they recognize that, trying to close the usage gap on 4G before rushing towards 5G. You need to prepare the ecosystem, otherwise it's going to be more dead investment.
May I jump in, John?
Please. And while you're doing that, I'm just going to share the results. So
sure, absolutely. So a couple of things. Obviously, I agree with what others have said already. On the policy side, which I think would be important to note, it would be absolutely important for us to take a much more comprehensive approach as to how policy and regulation can support the kind of investments and the kinds of thinking that both Raul and Thomas were just mentioning. I can tell you that, for example, for the estimates that we did for the investment model, we considered all of those different kinds of innovations, especially around satellites and low orbit options, etc. But going back to what Scott was saying in his presentation at the end, and looking at all the gamut of issues that policy and regulators have to address, we need to look at them first. The reality is that in many countries, without those frameworks being in place, and I think the ITU has done a tremendous job, as well as many others that I'm sure are here on this call, including ourselves, on how to think about the right framework, how to bring the right items to countries, to policymakers, so that all of the urgent elements are in place so that investments can come on board. Those are really important. Scott mentioned spectrum, others mentioned competition, issues around affordability and how to bring affordability, or how to make affordability a reality, are really important, around infrastructure sharing, around overall cost reduction of the industry through taxation and other items. We need to work on all of these things in tandem. They don't just work one or the other. So for us, I think the challenge, and I think this is a challenge in these regions specifically because of the size of the challenge in Asia, excuse me, is that we need to look at what are the most urgent issues that we can tackle to move everything together, but not just one or the other. Really a more holistic approach to the challenge, looking at some of the questions that have been addressed, thinking about investments, really, Thomas, really working with the MDBs in Asia and elsewhere to support the investments that are required without missing the opportunity that, if we're going to look at broadband infrastructure in a particular country, say Bangladesh that Raul was just mentioning, or Pakistan, let's not do that without also investing a percentage of those resources, 10%, 15%, what have you, in digital skills programming or in content development. because as we all said throughout these presentations, they go together. If people are not aware, if people don't have the skills, if people don't have the content that attract them to go online, there's no point in us spending resources on infrastructure. So these things have to happen at the same time. And I think that's really where the crust of the problem is, right? We need to bring it all together and not ignore anything. Everything is connected. And so for that to happen is partnerships. It's all about partnerships. Many of you mentioned that throughout the presentations. And I think we are all, many of us here have probably been involved in the overall digital cooperation efforts that the UN Secretary General has been leading. I think this is really an opportunity for us to do something about that new normal that Scott was talking about, you know, the recovery period. How do we change our practices so that the recovery and the new normal are much more influenced and informed by these experiences that we've had in the last few years? But I would say it's a lot more about coordination and doing many things at the same time without divorcing anything from each other, because it's all about coordination and partnership in the end, and tackling all of these different challenges that are quite significant for all of us. And in this region specifically, I would say the gender divide, without, you know, so we don't forget to mention once again, it's massive. I mean, the fact that in Bangladesh, in Pakistan, in many countries, the gender digital divide is still in the order of 50, 60%. That is unacceptable. So that's the other thing. When we think about skills and connectivity and infrastructure, are we considering replacing the infrastructure? Are we placing infrastructure where everyone has access in a way that everybody's going to be able to benefit from it? These are important questions that we need to consider.
Right, absolutely. Okay.
John, can I make a couple of comments?
Quickly, Scott.
Yeah,
so
very
then
good. I just wanted to say, I think there's some very good comments there from Sonia and others, but just one little reminder, and that is that, you know, who's making the investments? The mobile operators and others, and to ensure that they are going to make an adequate return. Because I think in the new COVID world, right, there might be cheap finance that might be available because of the, you know, the economic situation and that sort of thing, but you're still going to have to make a return. And I think that's really important that, you know, in the past we've seen maybe spectrum prices be too high, and there'll be a tendency maybe to load spectrum prices because other parts of the government budgets are under pressure, and the mobile phone industry or the telecoms industry is still making a lot of money. It's going to be under its own pressure. And I think that's really important now, not to be excessive returns, but to make sure that there are, you know, reasonable rates of return on their capital, on the risk that's being taken. And I think part of that is also important that you don't put technology limitations. For those who might be looking in 2020 on an investment, you know, oh, you need to stay with 2G, 3G. Really? Well, maybe if you go to a 4G, 5G upgradable platform, maybe that's going to be a better situation for you in Karachi or Ho Chi Minh City or whatever the case may be. And operators actually have a much better sense of their data and who their customer base is. And, you know, let's not forget, they are driven by making money and selling and providing services that customers want. And they are, I think, those, and plus all of the big techs, the Facebooks, the Googles, are all interested in making sure that this ecosystem does work and that everyone is connected. So I just wanted to make a word of caution there that, you know, remember that people need to make some money out of this process unless government's going to really fund a lot of this.
Yeah, absolutely. And it's all about complementary investments depending on what the return is and the perspective. And I think that's why the IT report is very interesting, because it sort of breaks down to some extent what may be relied upon from the private sector for this universal access investment versus from public sector sources, national governments, and DFIs. But with that, I know we've gone over time. Thank you all for still staying with us. I want to make sure that we give Atsuko Okuda a chance to give us the closing remarks. Obviously, we've had some great discussion here, and each one of these presenters could have just given an hour-and-a-half seminar, which would have been fascinating. Maybe that's what we should do next time. But let me turn it over to you, Atsuko, to give us the closing remarks.
Thank you, John. The excellent session, very rich discussion. And as you said, perhaps we should think about the way forward. But first of all, I would like to thank all the participants who joined us today from all across Asia and the Pacific. As you may know, some of the participants joined us 30 minutes before the webinar started. So it really shows the enthusiasm and, in fact, the relevance of this topic. And my special appreciations goes to all the presenters, the speakers who presented their unique insights to address the digital connectivity gaps and to enhance the affordability in Asia and the Pacific. I am sure we are all by now convinced that it is the priority, the urgent development imperative in the region, which originated from the existing digital divide, but is expected to become worse in a near future if we don't take action now and in a concerted way. There are indeed many webinars, as you all know, these days on this topic of digital connectivity and digital technology, especially in the context of a COVID-19 pandemics. But what we need is a group of organizations, partners, experts, and countries to come together with their respective strengths, expertise, and initiatives, and to address this formidable challenge in front of us in a concerted manner. And I think this webinar really showed that the combination of our insights and expertise is much greater than the addition and aggregation of the individual organizations. In this sense, I'm especially grateful to the leading experts who provided the participants with data, evidence, tools, expertise, and most importantly, commitment to working together and advancing this connectivity agenda in the most populous region in the world. And capitalizing on this opportunity and momentum, I would like to invite the participants, partners, and member countries to join the forces and apply and translate the insights and tools shared at the webinar today into action and concrete initiatives so that we can move forward and accelerate the pace to connect the unconnected. I reserved my special thanks to our moderator, John, until the end because I wanted to join others and congratulate you on the arrival of your new family member. You set the tone of this well-attended webinar and navigated seamlessly to the successful conclusion. So with that, I conclude my remarks and hope to see you all very soon. Until then, please stay safe and healthy. Back to you, John.
Great. Thank you so much, Atsuko. And just to stress, yeah, the more we can gather around this challenge, the more effective we can be in accelerating closure of the digital divide. So with that, I will point everybody to the ITU event page where the presentations are all posted. And you can see in most of the presentations, or if all the presentations, the contact information for the presenters, who encourage you to reach out to them directly to carry your conversations with them offline so we can move forward. All right, with that, I'm going to go ahead and say thank you to everybody and wish you a good day. Take care.
Thank you,
everyone.
Thank
Bye-bye.
you.
Bye.
Bye, everyone.
Bye-bye. Thanks,
Thank you.
everyone.
Thank you.
Thanks.